The red, yellow, blue primary colors are out of style and CMY is here to take the throne. But which brand sells the best CMY palette on the market? Welcome to the CMY trials where we find that out. Today we're testing out Utrecht's CMY primary palette that they just released in the past couple of months. As usual, I'm starting with our magenta versus yellow gradient test. Utrecht's decided to use quinacridone violet as their primary magenta and bismuth yellow mixed with titanium white as their primary yellow. As you can see, between the two colors, we get a very solid range of bright, warm reds all the way to some nice yellowish oranges. If you're familiar with the limitations of CMY, you might know that you can't get the brightest oranges on the market by mixing magenta and yellow. But the point of CMY is to get the most out of the fewest amount of colors, and we still get a very wide range of oranges with magenta and yellow. My only complaint is that Utrecht decided to use safflower oil for their yellow and linseed oil for their magenta. If you're going to sell a primary set that is meant to be used exclusively, you want to make sure that all of the paints have the same oil base. Safflower and linseed have different dry times, and so that might cause problems in the painting's drying process. But overall, I'd give our magenta versus yellow test an 8.5 out of 10. Moving on, we have our yellow versus cyan test. This is the same bismuth and titanium mix for our primary yellow, and for their primary cyan, we have the transparent phthalo blue. So far, all of the brands that we've tested have used phthalo blue pigment as their primary cyan, but everyone has used it kind of differently. In this case, we have a completely pure phthalo blue, which means we're getting it at its full tinting strength, which is super duper strong. If you've ever used phthalo pigments, you know that they completely take over the mixtures that you add them into. And that's why I'm being very careful to slowly add little bits of the phthalo into this green so that I don't completely overwhelm it. What I'm looking for in a good gradient between yellow and cyan in the CMY test is a solid range of very bright chromatic lime greens all the way down to some darker, more earthy, foresty greens. This is the only spectrum on the CMY palette that consists of one hue family, and that's green. So it's important that within that really wide spectrum of greens that we get as many options as physically possible. A lot of you might be wondering why phthalo blue is considered a primary cyan if it's labeled as blue. And that's because we have not used the term primary cyan when labeling pigments. Cyan wasn't originally even considered its own color for a very long time until printing. So the closest hues we have to a primary cyan are still labeled as a blue. Overall, I'd give this gradient test a 9 out of 10. Moving on to our final gradient test, magenta versus cyan. Now, I already know that a lot of you are ready to type up a comment saying that this just looks like red and blue. And you're not crazy for saying that. That's what these look like. But I want to point out that you are naturally drawn to thinking colors are closest to the primaries that you were taught. Maybe it's the contrary. The blues that you see might be closer to cyan, and the reds that you see might be closer to magenta. Magenta is only one step away from being a red, and cyan is only one step away from being a blue. So it's totally normal to associate the colors with being very similar with one another, but their differences make a huge impact. Since these are two transparent pigments, they absorb a lot of light. So when we mix them together, they create very dark, transparent hues. This can be incredibly useful for any painters who are looking to avoid using black right out of the tube. Because if you layer this very, very dark purple on top of itself a few times, you're going to get what looks like a black because it's absorbing so much light. The only downside to using transparent pigments in this sense is that we can't really see the true undertones of a lot of these purples. We just don't have enough light being reflected back to our eyes to gather all of that information when looking at these hues. So like I do with all of my other purple tests, I'm making sure to mix each option with some white, and that way we can really see the true bright undertones of a lot of these colors. I'm already a few brands into this journey of trying out all the CMY palettes available on the market, but I'm already starting to notice that I think a really solid CMY set is a fully transparent one. Unfortunately, I haven't found a brand that sells a fully transparent CMY set though, because everyone is always adding white into their yellows or using some sort of white or opaque pigment added into the magenta or cyan. But the beauty of using a transparent pigment for both your yellow, cyan, and magenta is that all you would have to do is mix each one of those with a little bit of white if you wanted to make those pigments opaque. This would allow you to get the full spectrum of those deeper, darker, more transparent hues and all of your lighter, brighter, more opaque hues, all while just using 3 tubes of paint color, plus a 4th one for white, of course. Overall, I'd give the magenta versus cyan test a 6.5 out of 10. Lastly, we have the black test. If you're familiar with CMY, you might have seen it written down as CMYK. K stands for key, which in printing means black ink. CMY in ink is considered not complete until you have black added into it. But in my opinion, when it comes to the paint pigments, you should absolutely be able to mix a pretty close match to neutral black using your 3 CMY colors. All you have to do is make sure that the 3 pigments you chose are transparent. Otherwise, when you neutralize that deep dark purple with your yellow to turn it into more of a black or gray hue, you end up lightening the total value of the black and making it just look more like a gray because your yellow isn't transparent. We were still able to get a pretty dark gray though, so I'd give the black test a 7 out of 10. Overall though, the Utrecht CMY set was a total hit. I'd give it a solid 8.5 out of 10. Thanks for watching!